By the time the organ swelled, my smile was already starting to ache. I was Claire Dawson, 30 years old, a single mom in a dress that cost more than my car, standing under the vaulted ceiling of St. Bridget Cathedral in downtown Chicago. 6 rows back, my daughter Mia sat with her small hands folded around a ribboned program, feet swinging above the polished stone. She kept looking at me like I was the one who needed rescuing. At the altar, Victor Kane waited as if he had been built for stillness. Tall, dark suit, winter eyes, no warmth. The men along the side aisles were his, not guests. They watched the doors, not the vows. The first thing I learned about marrying a man like Victor was that even God's house could feel like guarded territory. The priest moved through the ceremony with the careful speed of someone walking on ice. I barely heard the readings. I heard the camera shutters. I heard the soft rustle of designer fabrics every time someone leaned to whisper. I felt the weight of 600 strangers measuring my worth in real time, deciding what kind of woman sells herself into a name like Kane. My bouquet was white roses, but my fingers were numb around the stems. Somewhere inside my ribs, my heart kept asking the same childish question. Why did I agree to this? Then I would picture Mia's backpack hanging by our apartment door, the lunchbox with her stickers, the bills stacked on my kitchen counter, and the question would collapse into something colder. I did not agree for romance. I agreed for survival. 2 months earlier, I had sat across from Victor in a private dining room, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea. A lawyer had laid papers on the table like he was setting down a verdict. The numbers didn't scare me as much as the names attached to them, and the quiet certainty that my family would not be allowed to fail. Victor had watched me the way you watch a storm on the horizon, not hostile, just inevitable. I told myself I could live with inevitability if it meant Mia stayed in her school, in her room, in a life that didn't smell like overdue notices. So I learned to keep my face smooth. I learned to answer questions without begging. I learned to hold my chin up even when my stomach turned. This wedding wasn't a fairy tale. It was a shield I was paying for with my pride. When the moment came, it arrived with a single tilt of the priest's head, a gentle invitation to seal the vows. My body knew what to do before my mind could catch up. I turned toward Victor. I lifted my chin. I leaned in. Because that is what the room expected, what the photographs demanded, what the contract behind this wedding required. Victor did not lean in. He stepped back, one full step, clean and deliberate, as if distance was a decision he could make for both of us. The air changed. The silence swelled bigger than the organ, bigger than the chandeliers. I felt every eye snap toward us. Mia's chair scraped faintly as she shifted, and that tiny sound made me want to run. Victor's face didn't change, but he moved close enough that no one would accuse him of abandoning me. He angled his head as if to kiss, and instead he let words fall against my ear, low and controlled, telling me his heart belonged to someone else. Not me. Not this. Not the woman the crowd had gathered to watch him claim. A ripple of breath went through the first rows. People tried to hide it, but shock is louder than etiquette. My cheeks burned so hot I thought my makeup would melt. My lips were still parted, my body still leaning forward, stuck in the shape of hope I had never allowed myself to have. It felt like being pushed off a ledge in slow motion, except I had to land gracefully. I straightened. I forced my hands not to shake. I stared at Victor's throat because if I looked into his eyes, I might beg, or slap, or cry, and all three would make Mia's life harder. Victor turned away from the altar like the ceremony had simply reached its next step. His men shifted with him, shadows obeying a single center of gravity. The priest's face went pale. The cathedral kept breathing, but it did not feel alive. In that suspended second, I understood something the guests didn't. Victor Kane was not impulsive. He did not risk embarrassment without a reason. If he humiliated me in front of 600 witnesses, it was because humiliation was cheaper than whatever truth he was protecting. And if he could whisper that his heart belonged elsewhere, then somewhere in his world, there was a locked room with a name on the door. I glanced toward Mia. She was staring at Victor with open confusion, then back at me with a steadiness too old for six. I swallowed down the sting in my throat and gave her the smallest nod I could manage. We were going to get through this, whatever this was. I did not know yet how deep the trap went, or whose debt had built it, or how tightly my daughter's future was tied to a man who refused to kiss his own bride. But I felt the promise harden in me. I clean as steel. I would find the real reason behind his words. I would protect Mia, and I would not let this marriage swallow me whole. After Victor turned away from the altar, the ceremony kept moving like a train that refuses to stop for a broken passenger. I felt the heat in my cheeks, the weight of every stare, and the strange pressure to look grateful for a life I hadn't chosen. I found Mia's face in the pews and held it in my mind like a handrail. She was small, steady, watching me the way kids watch storms, waiting to see if the roof will hold. I smoothed my smile into place, walked where I was guided, signed what I was told to sign, and posed for photographs that would later pretend nothing went wrong. Inside, I was counting exits, counting men, counting seconds until I could breathe again. The humiliating part wasn't his refusal. It was knowing he had planned it, and knowing I still had to go with him. My wedding dress rustled with each step, and I promised myself I would not let my daughter see me crumble tonight ever again. I had swallowed the deal weeks before that cathedral, in a cramped office that smelled like lemon cleaner and old panic. My ex had vanished behind unpaid child support, and my landlord had started taping notices to the door. The worst part was my brother's stupid mistake, a loan he took to fix everything that only dragged us deeper. The number on the paper was $12,000, but the real threat sat beside it. A court date, a potential charge, and the kind of people who don't wait for judges. Victor's attorney laid out the trade in calm, polished language. If I married Victor Kane, the debt disappeared. My brother walked free, and Mia's life stayed intact. If I refused, I could lose our apartment, my job, and maybe my daughter. I remember looking at Mia's school photo on my phone, her missing front tooth, her grin bright as a dare, and realizing I would sign almost anything to keep that grin safe. I told myself love was optional. Safety wasn't. That night, a black SUV carried me away from the city lights and into the quiet hills of Kane Ridge. The veil was gone, my hairpins stabbed my scalp, and the diamond on my finger felt like a borrowed weapon. At the gates, cameras tracked the car as if it were prey. Inside, the estate rose from the trees, stone and glass, too elegant to call a bunker and too guarded to call a home. A housekeeper with soft eyes introduced herself as Rose Harper and guided me through hallways that smelled of waxed wood and expensive silence. Staff moved like they had rehearsed being invisible. They watched my face for clues, like they were trying to guess whether I'd be kind or cruel, whether I'd last or vanish. My room was beautiful in the way a cage can be beautiful. Creamy walls, thick curtains, a view of the river that looked like freedom from far away. My suitcase had arrived before me. Fresh flowers waited, like staged forgiveness. Rose led me to the closet, then hesitated, as if she hated delivering the next line. She explained that Victor's quarters were in the east wing, mine in the west. Separate wings, like separation, could be poured into floor plans. The word marriage kept echoing in my head, all but the architecture corrected it. I wasn't a wife. I was a housed solution. A knock came after midnight. Victor stood in the doorway without taking a step inside, sleeves rolled up, eyes flat, as if emotion was a language he no longer spoke. He laid out the arrangement the way he laid out everything, with clean edges. My family would be protected. My brother's problem would be erased. I would appear at his side when needed, smile for cameras, and keep my questions out of his business. In return, I would get stability and a safe place for Mia. I listened, and then I decided something silently. I could obey terms without surrendering myself. Not tonight. Not ever. Not for her. After he left, the corridor swallowed his footsteps and the silence returned. But it felt different now, like a rule had been spoken aloud. I sat on the bed, peeled off the heavy dress, and stared at my reflection in the window. I looked like a woman playing someone else's role. Underneath the exhaustion, anger kept sparking. Not loud, just steady. I couldn't change Victor's past or his locked heart, not yet, but I could control what Mia would feel in this place. I would learn the staff's names. I would watch how power moved through these halls. I would make myself useful, because usefulness is a kind of shield. I would keep my head high, because shame feeds predators. Somewhere down the hall I heard Rose speaking softly to someone, a tired voice smoothing over crisis. This house ran on fear and fatigue. I decided I would become the one calm thing in it. Tomorrow, Mia would walk through these doors, and she would not be raised on terror. Mia arrived at Kane Ridge with her backpack on and her stuffed rabbit pressed to her chest. The SUV door opened, and cold Midwest air rushed in, carrying pine and river water. She didn't cry. She just watched, eyes wide, taking in the stone house, the iron gate, the men in dark coats. I felt guilt rise like bile, because I brought her into a world that needed guards. I took her hand and squeezed twice, our old signal for, I'm here, you're safe. I promised myself I would earn that promise even if it meant changing myself first today. Inside, the estate sounded like a place holding its breath. Shoes moved quietly on polished floors. Voices stayed low, even when no one was nearby. Rose Harper met us at the entry with a practiced smile that didn't reach her tired eyes. Two housekeepers hovered behind her, hands folded, waiting for instruction. I noticed how they glanced past me, toward the hall that led to Victor's wing, like the temperature of the house depended on his mood. Mia noticed too. She tugged my sleeve and leaned closer. I kept my posture calm, but my mind mapped exits, cameras, and men. Rose guided Mia and me down a corridor lined with portraits of strangers who looked like they never smiled. She kept moving, directing staff with tiny gestures, smoothing chaos before it surfaced. I watched her shoulders, the way they carried invisible weight. When Mia's rabbit slipped from her arms, Rose bent to pick it up before anyone else could, gentle as a grandmother. That softness made my throat tighten. In my old life, kindness happened in borrowed moments. Here it felt like contraband. Rose showed us a sitting room with a basket stocked, and I realized someone planned for Mia. Eddie Brooks appeared at the edge of the foyer like a quiet checkpoint, broad-shouldered, calm, eyes that missed nothing. He knelt to Mia's height without touching her, letting her decide the distance. Mia studied him, then nodded once, satisfied. I noticed a worn wedding band on his hand and a faded photo tucked behind his badge clip, a teenager in a football jersey. When I mentioned it, Eddie's expression shifted, surprised that I saw him as more than a uniform. He told Rose the safest path to the garden, and everyone listened. I hated needing it, but I felt relieved. Victor did not greet Mia. He stayed in his wing, a presence you sensed when doors closed softly and men straightened. But that evening I noticed details. A guard near the playroom, another at the stairs, radios turned low. And the kitchen received instructions to keep knives stored and counters clear when Mia wandered in with me. Rose didn't explain. She adjusted, like the house had changed its breathing. No one praised Victor. The message was clear. He would not soothe my daughter, but he would shield her. That contradiction sat heavy in my chest, parts gratitude and warning, night long. At bedtime, I unpacked Mia's pajamas and her worn picture book, the one with pages taped at the spine. Normal things mattered more in strange places. I brushed her hair and listened to her small questions tumble out, half curiosity, half worry. I answered with softness while my brain kept running numbers. School enrollment, doctor forms, how to find the pharmacy, how to keep her from feeling trapped. In the hallway, footsteps passed like a patrol, and Mia asked if the men were soldiers. I told myself they were just there to keep people away. I wasn't sure I believed it. The next morning, Rose brought a tray with cereal, sliced fruit, and a tiny carton of milk, the kind Mia liked. She didn't mention how she knew, and I didn't ask. Mia ate quietly, then wandered to the window to watch the river move. Outside, Victor crossed the courtyard with 2 men behind him, coat collar up, gaze fixed forward. He never looked toward our wing, yet the security detail shifted around him like planets around a sun. Mia watched him for a long time, then looked back at me as if she had solved a puzzle I couldn't today. Later, as I zipped her coat, Mia leaned in and gave me her verdict. She felt Victor was scary, because everyone moved near him like he was thunder. But she also felt he was lonely, because nobody smiled at him the way they smiled at her. Her words hit me soft and sharp. I had been calling him a monster in my head, because monsters are easier to hate than complicated men. Mia made that lie impossible. I watched the staff flinch at footsteps, and I chose my next move. If fear ruled this house, kindness would become my rebellion. By the 3rd morning at Kane Ridge, I stopped waiting for permission to exist. The house was huge and quiet, and everyone moved as if the walls were listening. If I let that silence swallow me, Mia would learn the same lesson. Stay small, stay grateful, don't make trouble. I had already swallowed one deal for her. I wasn't going to swallow my dignity too. So I chose the simplest kind of rebellion. I made myself useful. After breakfast, I followed Rose into the kitchen and asked what needed doing. I didn't pose it like a favor. I made it sound normal, the way I used to at my second job when Mia was a toddler and rent was due. Rose blinked, then handed me towels. I folded, wiped counters, and washed my hands until they stopped shaking. The cook watched me like I might be performing, but when I asked his name and remembered it later, his shoulders eased. In this house, being seen was rare. Over the next few days, I learned small things on purpose. Which housekeeper hated the vacuum's whine because it reminded her of a hospital? Which gardener saved extra apples for Mia? Which guard liked his coffee black and pretended he didn't? I didn't push for stories. I just offered attention in quiet doses, like setting candles in a drafty room. At night, when the halls cooled and the estate turned into a checkpoint, I carried a tray of coffee to the security desk. Eddie accepted first, steady and polite. The others followed a beat later, still wary. No one smiled, but no one flinched either. That felt like progress. It told me fear could loosen, one small choice at a time here. Rose watched my little routines with a look I couldn't name. Relief, maybe. Fear, too. She ran the estate like a woman balancing plates, never letting anyone wobble long enough to crash. But exhaustion lived in the way she pressed 2 fingers to her temple when she thought no one noticed. I found her in the pantry on a Wednesday afternoon, crouched between shelves of canned soup and flour. She wasn't sobbing loudly. She was leaking silent tears, the kind that come from holding it together for too long. An envelope lay open in her lap. A hospital portal glowed on her phone. When she saw me, she tried to erase her face quickly, like tears were a rule she'd broken. I sat on the floor across from her and waited. Rose's grandson needed surgery. Not tomorrow, maybe surgery, but soon surgery. Insurance had refused half of it. The bills kept arriving anyway. Rose didn't ask me for money. She didn't even ask me for help. She just let the truth fall out because the pantry was the only room where she could be human without an audience. That night, after Mia's bath and 2 bedtime stories, I stood outside Victor's study door until my legs went numb. Asking him for anything felt like stepping into a storm. Not because he would raise his voice, but because he might look at me with that empty calm and decide my problem wasn't worth his time. Still, I pictured Rose shaking over that envelope. I pictured Mia's face if I ever had to choose between groceries and a doctor. I couldn't unsee either. I went in without knocking. Victor sat behind his desk, phone in hand, the room smelling faintly of smoke and cedar. I kept my voice steady in my head and laid out the facts like I would to a school administrator. Rose had kept this house running for years. Her grandson needed surgery, and she couldn't afford it. I wasn't begging. I was reminding Victor that loyalty isn't a one-way street. He didn't soften. He recalculated. I watched it happen behind his eyes, quick and cold, like math. He ended a call, wrote something down, made another. No speech, no comfort. Just action, efficient and final. Then he gave me a small nod that felt like dismissal and agreement at once. Within 48 hours, Rose's grandson had a surgery date, a surgeon, and a private hospital room. Relief hit Rose so hard she had to grip the counter. She didn't make a scene. She thanked me with a look that said she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her without demanding payment. After that, the house changed in tiny ways. The cook hummed while he worked. A guard held the door for Mia and didn't pretend it was an accident. Rose stopped rubbing her knuckles raw. Almost nothing. But in this place, almost nothing was everything. That evening, Victor came to dinner on time. He sat, glanced my way, and offered a brief greeting, like it cost him. I answered calmly, refusing to act surprised, but inside I felt the latch of a locked door shift. Later, when Mia asked for a new bedtime book, I found myself drifting toward the estate library, suddenly curious about what other secrets were tucked into Victor Kane's walls. 2 days after Rose's grandson got his surgery date, Kane Ridge felt like it exhaled. Not happy, not safe, just a little less clenched. Rose stopped flinching every time a phone rang, and Mia started humming while she colored at the breakfast table. Even the guards looked more like men than statues. That afternoon, Mia asked for a story about a princess who didn't need rescuing. I promised I'd find one, and I followed the quiet hallway toward the library. The door opened with the soft resistance of old wood. Inside, the air smelled of paper and cedar, and the light was muted as if the room preferred secrets. A rolling ladder rested against tall shelves. Rain and dust floated lazily where the sun cut through the curtains. I scanned spines for anything child-sized, then reached for a thin book of fairy tales. The moment I tugged it free, a square of glossy paper slid out and fluttered to the floor. It landed face up, and my pulse jumped like I'd dropped something fragile. I should have put it back without looking, the way you avert your eyes from private grief. Instead, I knelt, because curiosity is a stubborn animal, and picked it up by the corners. A woman sat on a park bench, laughing at something beyond the frame. Her hair was dark and loose, her eyes bright, her whole face lit with the kind of joy that doesn't pose. She looked ordinary in a way that felt extraordinary next to Victor's world of polished control. The photo wasn't glamorous. It was intimate, taken by someone who loved watching her breathe. I turned it over, and 2 words in sharp handwriting stopped me cold. Always, Elena. My mouth went dry, because I remembered the whisper at the altar and the way Victor stepped back like love was a weapon. Someone else had a name, and it wasn't a rumor. I stared at the ink until it felt like it was staring back. For a second I imagined marching to his study, holding the photo out like evidence, demanding an explanation. Then I pictured Mia upstairs, trusting me to keep her world steady, and the urge collapsed. In a house built on power, you don't poke wounds unless you're ready for blood. I slipped the photo back into the book, returned it to the shelf, and carried Elena's name around like a splinter under my skin. Over the next week, I listened more than I spoke. Eddie mentioned Elena once while checking the driveway cameras, and his voice went careful, as if the walls could report him. Rose said her name another day while folding napkins, then pressed her lips together like she'd said too much. I stitched their fragments into a story, the way you patch a child's ripped jacket with whatever thread you have. Elena Vale had been a second-grade teacher on the South Side, the kind who kept extra granola bars for kids who came to school hungry. She met Victor before he became a headline, when he still believed he could outrun his own name. She argued with him, laughed at him, and somehow made him show up in daylight. He started talking about leaving, about building something legitimate, about being a man a woman like her wouldn't have to fear. Then a rival crew learned her name. They didn't care who she was, they cared what she meant to him. Victor got her back, but the timing was cruel, and she died after days in a hospital bed while he kept his hand wrapped around hers and tried to bargain with a universe that doesn't bargain. After that, he didn't just become colder, he became precise. He built walls, and he learned to treat affection like an exposed nerve. The altar whisper wasn't arrogance, it was a man refusing to repeat a tragedy. Understanding that didn't erase my humiliation, but it changed its shape. It made me see fear under his control, grief under his silence. And once I saw it, I started noticing other things too. Victor's gaze lingered a fraction longer when Mia laughed, and his men stopped treating me like furniture. Or one evening I found a new set of childproof latches on the cabinet under the sink, installed without announcement. Another morning, fresh herbs appeared in small planters by the kitchen window, the exact thing I'd mentioned in passing. I told myself it was coincidence, but my stomach didn't believe me. Something inside Victor Kane was shifting, slow as dawn, and I had no idea whether that should comfort me or terrify me. I tucked Mia into bed, held the fairy tale book in my hands, and wondered who Elena Vale had been to him, and who I was becoming now. After I found the photo, I stopped calling Victor Kane cold. Cold sounded like a choice. Armor felt truer, and armor can come from love as much as it can come from violence. Knowing that made me careful. Curiosity in this house had sharp edges, and I had Mia to protect from every edge. Still, the days softened in small ways. Rose hummed while she folded linen, a low tune that kept her hands steady. The guards began to greet Mia with nods that looked almost normal. Even the air in the halls felt warmer, like the house was learning a new rhythm and testing it quietly. One afternoon, I noticed Eddie's men had switched positions near the playroom. Not closer, but smarter. One watched the windows instead of the door. Another kept his radio lower. Nobody announced the change. It just happened, as if the estate itself had decided Mia deserved a quieter kind of safety. I pretended not to see, because in Victor's world, gratitude could be misread as weakness. Mia didn't pretend. She drifted through the kitchen asking Rose a dozen questions about food, about gardens, about whether the river froze in winter. Our Rose answered patiently, and I offered to make something simple with them, the kind of recipe that didn't require perfection. We chose sugar cookies because Mia liked pressing shapes into dough, and because the smell of baking makes any place feel less like a fortress. Flour clouded the counter the moment Mia started stirring. She sneezed, laughed, and left a white print on her nose. Rose tried to keep order, then gave up and laughed too, a sound that surprised her more than it surprised me. I watched them and felt my throat tighten. Joy in Kane Ridge was usually muted, like music played through a wall. This was loud, messy, real. I was wiping Mia's hands when I sensed movement behind me. I turned and saw Victor in the doorway, half shadow, half man. He didn't step in. He didn't tell us to lower our voices or stop wasting time. He simply watched, eyes steady, as if he had wandered into a memory and didn't know whether to touch it. Mia noticed him and froze for a second, then held up a cookie cutter like it's an offering. Victor's expression didn't soften, but he didn't leave. He nodded once and stayed long enough for Mia to relax, and for Rose to keep laughing. Then he was gone, silent as he'd come, leaving the room warmer than before. The next morning he appeared at the main breakfast table at a normal hour, not before dawn, not standing, not eating alone in his wing. He sat across from me with a newspaper he didn't really read. I didn't make a show of it. I poured coffee, sliced Mia's banana, and kept my voice calm. Inside, my heart thumped like it wanted applause. I refused to give it any. If Victor was stepping closer, I wasn't going to chase him and scare him back behind his walls. That day I found herb planters by the kitchen window. Basil, rosemary, mint, already sprouting. I had mentioned once, offhand, that fresh herbs made cheap meals taste like care. No one claimed credit. Rose looked at the pots and looked away with a small smile. I thought about Elena Vale, about a woman who must have filled Victor's life with ordinary details, and I wondered if this was how he remembered love. Not in speeches, but in small adjustments that said, "I heard you." Mia began to settle. She learned which hallway led to the library, which staff member kept crayons, which guard liked her rabbit. I started filling out school paperwork at the kitchen table, the kind of normal task that anchors a mother's life. Kane Ridge didn't feel safe, not truly, but it felt less hostile, and that difference mattered. That evening I noticed a nightlight glowing in the hallway outside Mia's room, enough not to wake her. I hadn't asked for it. Victor didn't mention it. The house learned where my child slept. Hope crept in like sunrise, slow and unstoppable, and it scared me because sunrise makes you forget the night. Victor's world still had enemies, still had rules, still had teeth. Warmth in the house didn't erase any of that. It only raised the stakes, because now there was something worth losing. When Eddie told me we had to go into Chicago the next day for Mia's enrollment meeting and a pediatric checkup, my stomach tightened. I nodded anyway. I couldn't keep her hidden forever. I just had to believe that the thin thread of trust forming in this house would hold when the road opened up and the outside world came rushing in. Thursday morning, the sky over Kane Ridge was the color of wet concrete. We had to drive into Chicago for Mia's school enrollment paperwork and a quick pediatric records drop, the boring errands that make a child's life feel normal. Victor's office insisted the forms be signed in person, and I refused to let fear turn my daughter into a shut-in. Mia stayed behind with Rose, wrapped in a blanket with her rabbit, because the appointment was adults talking in waiting rooms. I kissed her forehead, told myself to breathe steady, and followed Eddie to the SUV. Eddie drove with one hand on the wheel and the other near his radio. A second security car trailed us. He changed routes twice. I'm not dramatic, just quiet competence, and I watched the mirrors anyway. The farther we got from the estate, the more my body remembered that Victor's protection didn't erase his enemies. At an overpass, a black sedan slipped behind us and held position. No front plate. Windows too dark. Eddie's shoulders tightened a fraction. Then another sedan appeared ahead, drifting slow enough to force our speed down. The one behind edged closer. The highway turned into a corridor with no doors. Eddie touched his radio. I didn't hear words, only the click and the way the air thickened inside the cabin. My hands curled in my lap, nails biting skin, and I pictured Mia's small face if I didn't come back tonight. The first hit was a shove against our rear quarter panel, not loud, but meant to move us. Eddie corrected, but the sedan struck again, harder. trying to spin us into traffic. I folded forward, making myself small, my breath shallow. Eddie aimed for the shoulder, then for an exit ramp. The front sedan swerved to block it. Metal filled my vision. Tires screamed. A sharp crack snapped behind me, and the rear window spidered, spilling glittering glass beads onto my hair and jacket. Another crack followed, and I stopped pretending this was an accident. In that compressed, electric moment, a thought landed like ice. This wasn't about me. It was about Victor. They were reaching for him through the one part of his world that didn't wear armor. I felt anger flare through the fear, hot and helpless. I wasn't collateral. I was a message. Eddie's voice dropped into the radio again. His jaw was locked so tight I saw the muscle jump. The security car behind us surged closer, and for a second the sedans tightened their box, trying to finish what they started. 4 minutes can feel like a lifetime when you count heartbeats, but in less than that, 2 black SUVs appeared from behind like hard punctuation. They forced the sedans to break formation. The blocker swerved across lanes and vanished down an off-ramp. The car behind us peeled away between trucks, practiced and fast. Then the highway opened, and the threat evaporated so quickly it felt unreal. Back at Kane Ridge, the gate swung wide before we stopped. Victor was already in the drive, coat unbuttoned, eyes like storm glass fixed on the shattered rear window. He didn't rush to touch me. He scanned damage, scanned Eddie, scanned the sky like he could see enemies in the clouds. And then I saw it. His hands trembled once at his sides. A small betrayal of control that told me the attack landed exactly where it was meant to. The estate turned into a machine. Men flooded the property. Radios hissed. Eddie reported in clipped bursts while someone pressed gauze to a small cut on his shoulder he tried to ignore. Victor's voice cut through everything, low and lethal, sending people to checkpoints, sealing roads, making calls that reshaped the night. I stayed near the kitchen, smoothing my face before Mia looked up, because she deserved calm, not a mother made of panic. It was past midnight when Victor came to my door. I was in an armchair with a towel around my shoulders, still picking glass from my hair. He stood there in a dark shirt, sleeves rolled, the same controlled shape he wore like armor, but his gaze kept dropping to my hands, to the glass, to the places I could have been hurt. He asked if I was okay without softness, yet the question itself was a crack. I told him I was mostly fine, because that's what mothers say when they're still shaking inside. He sat on the edge of the bed, close enough that the room felt smaller, and I understood why he built distance like walls. Caring was dangerous. Caring made you a target. Caring made a powerful man's hands shake. When he left, the cold rushed back in, and I pressed my palm to my chest and admitted the truth I'd been avoiding. I was starting to feel something for him, and that terrified me more than the ambush. I lay awake listening to the estate settle, wondering which enemy had chosen us, and how long they would keep hunting. For 3 days after that, Kane Ridge stayed on alert, a quiet war room pretending to be a home. On the 4th evening, Rose told me Victor wanted to see me in his study. My stomach flipped because I could feel the weight of a confession coming, and I wasn't sure my heart was ready to hear it. 3 days after the highway, Kane Ridge looked normal again, but it sounded wrong. Radios were lower, doors clicked more often, and every man in a dark coat watched the tree line like it might move. I kept Mia close to routine, pancakes at the same time, homework at the same corner of the table, stories before bed. My hands still found tiny glass flecks in my hair when I washed it. Fear leaves crumbs behind. On the 3rd evening, Rose appeared at my door with that careful expression she used when the house was about to shift. She told me Victor wanted me in his study. Mia was already asleep, rabbit tucked under her chin, my nightlight glowing in the hall. I kissed her forehead and felt the familiar mother math start up. If I upset Victor, does it ripple to Mia? If I stay quiet, Does someone else pay? The east wing was quieter than the rest of the estate, as if sound itself had learned not to challenge him there. The study door opened into dark wood and warm lamplight, the kind that makes a room feel private even when you know nothing is truly private. A single painting hung behind his desk, a strip of blue water and pale sky, too peaceful to belong to him. The scent of coffee lingered, sharp and honest. Victor stood by the window, not sitting, as if a chair would make him vulnerable. He didn't tell me to sit. He simply waited until I did, like he was testing whether I would take space without being granted it. Then he said her name. Elena Vale. Hearing it out loud tightened my chest because it turned the altar whisper into something real. His gaze stayed on the river beyond the glass while he began. He told the story in pieces, like he was handing me glass and trusting I wouldn't squeeze. They met in a coffee shop on a day that mattered to no one else. She corrected his order, teased him for acting like he owned the room, and then laughed when he looked offended. In his memory, she was not impressed by money or fear. She cared about small things, her students, broken pencils, winter boots on kids who didn't have any. Somewhere along the way, he said, he stopped feeling like a role and started feeling like a man. He took her to ordinary places on purpose, places without bodyguards, places where he had to stand in line and wait. He listened to her talk about teaching as if it was a mission. He made plans he had never dared to make before. A clean exit, legitimate work, a future that didn't come with funerals. Then the tone in his voice thinned, like a wire pulled too tight. A rival crew learned her name and decided it was leverage. He brought her back, but not fast enough. And he spent 3 days in a hospital room watching machines do what his power couldn't. He described holding her hand and realizing, too late, that love had given his enemies a map. When she died, the part of him that believed in tomorrow died with her. He finally looked at me then, and I saw how hard it was to let me see anything. He explained the promise he made beside that bed. Never again. Never again let someone close enough to be used. I never again risk a woman's life because he wanted warmth. The words he had pressed into my ear at the altar were not meant to punish me. They were his way of keeping a vow to a dead woman, even if it turned me into a spectacle. I sat there with my hands folded so I wouldn't reach for him or slap the desk. I felt sympathy and fury in the same breath. Sympathy, because grief had chained him to one moment for years. Fury, because he had chosen to chain me beside him without warning. But I kept my voice gentle in my own head, the way I speak to Mia when she's afraid of the dark. I told him fear can look like protection, but it teaches everyone inside it to live smaller. I had lived that way once, tiptoeing around my ex's moods, calling it peace, until Mia started tiptoeing too. I said that honoring Elena didn't require a lifetime of loneliness, and that keeping his heart locked didn't resurrect her. It only buried him. The room went so still I heard the clock tick. Victor's hands braced on the desk, knuckles whitening, and for a long moment, he didn't speak at all. That silence felt like surrender and battle at once. When I stood to leave, tears slid down my face, and I let them. Outside the study, the hall light seemed brighter. After that night, he began appearing at meals, doors left open, steps less distant. But the house was already tightening again, and I could feel trouble gathering inside the fortress. Even before anyone spoke of leaks, I sensed betrayal nearby. After the night Victor said Elena's name, Kane Ridge almost felt human. He started showing up to dinner, and once I caught him standing in the doorway of the playroom, watching Mia stack blocks like the world was simple. For 2 days, the house breathed easier. Then the pressure came back like winter air under a door. Late Friday afternoon, Eddie's radio never stopped murmuring. Men I hadn't seen before appeared in the halls with tablets instead of smiles. Doors that used to be merely closed were now latched. Rose stopped humming. Even Mia noticed, because she asked why the grown-ups were whispering again. I kept our routine anyway. Pancakes, backpack check, a story at bedtime. When fear gets loud, a mother gets practical. I set Mia up at the kitchen island with crayons, and I helped Rose portion soup into containers for the staff, because feeding people is one of the few ways to keep a house from turning feral. Victor moved through it all like a machine running hot. He slept less, ate standing up, and spoke in shorter bursts that ended phone calls like guillotine drops. His jaw stayed clenched, and his eyes had that faraway focus of a man tracking threats in math, not feelings. When he did glance at me, it wasn't cold. It was guarded, as if he didn't trust himself to care. Grant Hale came by the kitchen twice that day. Grant was Victor's second, the steady one. The man who always acknowledged Rose's work and never treated me like decoration. Mia liked him because he knelt to her height and let her show him her drawings without pretending he had someplace better to be. Once, when her shoelace snapped, he pulled a spare from his pocket like he'd planned for a child's emergency in a world built for war. So when I found the paper outside Victor's study, my stomach sank before I even read it. It was a single printed page, creased as if it had been snatched from a stack in a hurry. Half the lines were blacked out, but the remaining words were sharp enough to cut. Internal leak, federal interest, suspected source, Grant Hale. There were timestamps and initials, too neat, too clean, the kind of evidence that tells you what to think. I stared at it until the letters blurred. In Victor's world, suspicion wasn't an argument. It was a sentence waiting for a signature. I knew what happened to people labeled traitor, even if no one ever said it out loud in front of me or Mia. They didn't get trials. They got erased. I had seen that kind of erasure before, and it never stayed quiet afterward. The problem was, the page felt wrong in my hands. Not because I wanted Grant to be innocent, but because the story didn't fit the man I'd watched. Grant's loyalty showed up in small, boring ways. Arriving early, checking doors twice, calming younger men when tempers rose. Betrayal usually has a smell, and Grant didn't have it. The document, though, smelled like performance. I thought about Elena. I thought about Victor's vow, the way grief could make a man choose the fastest route to control. If Victor believed Grant had sold him out, he would act before doubt could weaken him. And if I spoke up, I might become the next problem to solve. I had Mia sleeping down the hall. I had finally built a thin layer of peace for her in this fortress. Was I really going to risk it for a man who might still be guilty? I folded the paper and hid it in my sweater pocket like it could burn me. On that night at dinner, Victor barely touched his food. Rose's hands shook when she refilled his water. The guards outside the doors rotated every 30 minutes. Mia asked for a second story, and I read with a steady voice while my mind replayed that redacted page again and again. Just past midnight, I sat at the edge of my bed and listened to the estate settle into an uneasy quiet. I pictured Grant's face when he smiled at Mia's drawing. I pictured Victor's hands braced on his desk in the study, fighting himself. I pictured what Mia would learn if the adults around her solved problems with disappearing people. By the time the sky began to pale, my decision was made. At dawn, I would go to Victor, and I would ask for the one thing he never offered anyone. Time. A promise to hear the full truth before he pulled the trigger on his own conscience. If that promise broke the fragile trust between us, so be it. I would rather lose his favor than watch him become a monster again. Just before dawn, I stood in the kitchen with a mug I didn't drink. The estate was awake in the way a body is awake when it can't sleep. Lights low, footsteps soft, radios whispering behind doors. Rose kept Mia's breakfast routine moving like a shield, and I kept smiling at my daughter as if my ribs weren't full of stones. Mia's hair stuck up in the back, and she asked for extra syrup. I gave it to her, kissed her forehead, and watched her shuffle toward the playroom with her rabbit tucked under one arm. Only when the door clicked shut did I let my face fall. Eddie met me at the hallway junction and didn't try to stop me. He just gave me a look that said he knew where I was going and what it could cost. I walked anyway, one careful step at a time, my palm damp on the folded paper in my pocket. Victor's study door was half open. Inside, the air smelled like coffee that had been reheated too many times. Victor sat behind his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled, eyes sharpened by sleeplessness. Grant's name was on a notepad beside his phone. I stepped into the room and forced my voice to stay steady in my own head. I asked him for time. Not mercy, not softness. Time, and a promise that he would hear everything before he acted on suspicion. I laid the redacted printout on his desk and watched his gaze drop to it like a blade finding its target. He didn't react the way I expected. No explosion, no visible anger. Just a long, dangerous quiet as he read. That silence pressed against my skin. I felt the urge to apologize for breathing in his space, and I swallowed it. I had not come here to be small. I told him what felt wrong. The page was too neat, too eager to point at Grant. It used tidy labels instead of messy facts. It showed conclusions without showing the path. And it had appeared on the floor outside his study like bait, as if someone wanted it found at the exact moment his temper was closest to the edge. My hands shook, but I kept going. Grant had been steady around Mia, respectful with Rose, consistent in the boring ways traitors usually aren't. If Victor acted fast, he might kill the wrong man and hand his enemies exactly what they wanted: chaos, guilt, and a leadership gap. I told him I wasn't defending Grant because I was naive. I was defending Victor from becoming the version of himself he claimed he hated, the version that solves fear with erasure. Victor's eyes lifted to mine, and for a second I thought I had gone too far. Then he picked up his phone and made 3 calls. He didn't raise his voice. He gave short instructions that sounded like doors locking. He ordered a silent review of logs, routes, and access times. He told Eddie to bring Grant in calmly, and told someone else to pull Caleb Shore's communications for the last 2 weeks. The room stayed still while his world moved. I stood with my hands clasped, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. Somewhere outside, boots crossed tile. A printer started up. 10 minutes later, a man in a suit appeared with a tablet, and Victor scanned it without blinking. The story unraveled fast. Caleb Shore had been feeding information to federal contacts in exchange for leniency on an older charge. When the net tightened, he panicked and planted evidence that pointed upward, toward Grant, because Grant was visible and trusted. The redactions on the printout hid the giveaway details, but Victor's team found the raw data underneath. Badge swipes, camera angles, a deleted message recovered from a burner phone. Grant was cleared before he even understood he was accused. Caleb was taken quietly, removed like a splinter before it infected the whole body. No blood in the halls, no shouting. Just the cold efficiency of a man who had chosen proof over rage. By late that night, the estate had settled again, but I couldn't. I sat on the garden bench wrapped in a coat, staring at the herbs by the kitchen window. Victor found me there, not with apologies, but with the kind of presence that meant he had been looking. He acknowledged, in his own guarded way, that I had risked everything, that I had been right to demand truth first. I told him that restraint was harder than violence, and that if he wanted a legacy Mia could live under without fear, he would have to keep choosing the harder thing. When he walked back toward the house, he didn't tell me to stay safe. He didn't need to. The way he slowed his pace to match mine said it for him. And I realized the most dangerous part wasn't the enemies outside the gates. It was that Victor Kane was beginning to trust me, and I was beginning to want that trust more than I should. That week after the leak was handled, Kane Ridge went quiet in the way a house does after a storm. No sirens, no shouting, just the return of sounds. Rose clinking dishes, Mia humming over homework, the river moving past the windows. My shoulders dropped. I still checked locks out of habit, but the panic stopped buzzing in my teeth. For the first time since the wedding, I let myself imagine a future beyond surviving today for me and Mia. Victor started appearing where he didn't need to be. I would be packing Mia's lunch, and he would pause at the doorway like he'd forgotten what room he meant to enter. Once, he asked which form needed a signature, not because he cared about paperwork, but because he cared that I cared. Another evening he walked past the kitchen twice, as if he was learning the sound of our life. He noticed Mia's routines, too. The night she fell asleep reading, I found the book returned to her bedside, a ribbon marking the page. The next morning her boots were lined by the door, cleaned of mud. Victor never mentioned any of it. He just kept circling, careful, like a man testing ice with his foot before trusting it with weight. I felt warmed and watched at the same time. On Sunday evening, the house settled early. Rose took Mia upstairs, and I escaped to the library window seat with tea and a stack of picture books. The lamp cast a soft circle over the pages, and the rest of the room waited in shadow, smelling of paper and cedar. I heard footsteps behind me and didn't turn. I knew them. Victor moved quietly, as if he feared startling something inside himself. He stopped across from me, clasped, eyes tired. Without sitting, he told me he needed to say something and asked me not to fill the silence for him. I nodded, because I'd learned his pauses were where truth lived. He admitted he married me like a line item. He saw my desperation and assumed I would accept whatever terms he offered, then fade into the wallpaper of his life. He expected me to be grateful for the mansion, the money, the protection, and he expected my voice to shrink. Hearing that stung, yet it felt clean. He was naming the cruelty instead of calling it fate. He watched my face, bracing for impact as if honesty could hurt. Then he spoke about the house, as if it were a living thing I'd rearranged. Rose humming, staff lingering to talk. Mia laughing without checking the hallway first. Dinners happening at the table instead of in separate wings. He said he noticed the change, and it made him realize I was doing more than surviving. I was building. His gaze dipped to my hands. I busy when I was nervous, and he admitted he didn't know how to stand near warmth without fearing it would burn even when he wanted it. His voice grew quieter when he mentioned Elena. He didn't try to rewrite the past. He simply said grief had been safer than hope. Keeping his heart locked with her meant no one else could be used against him. But lately, he had felt that lock slipping. He said my steadiness, my kindness, my refusal to disappear, had pulled something in him back toward life, and that frightened him more than any rival. If he let himself love me, he would spend days imagining he failed to protect me again. I listened, not romanticizing it. Love in his world came with consequences, but so did loneliness. I told him Elena wasn't killed by being loved. She was killed by people who chose cruelty. Our hiding from love didn't make him safe. It only made him empty, and it taught people around him to live on tiptoe. I thought of Mia, of how children learn fear by watching adults. I told him I would not be pushed away for good. If he wanted me here, he had to let me be real. Victor finally sat, and it looked like surrender. He rubbed his knuckles, then covered my hand, careful, as if I might pull away. His skin was warm. My throat tightened. I leaned closer until our foreheads nearly touched, and the room went quiet except for breath. In that closeness, I felt his control crack into something human, and I knew there was no going back, not for either of us. After he left, I stayed at the window and watched the river move. My hand still held the shape of his touch. Over the next days, he kept orbiting, quiet and present. Miss and the house adjusted around it. Then Rose told me Victor wanted a gathering in the garden, just the people who made Kane Ridge run. My stomach flipped, because I remembered the altar and the way I felt exposed. I sensed he planned to mirror that moment and correct it in public. I didn't know if I was ready to be seen again, but I wanted to try. 6 months later, Kane Ridge looked different at dusk. String lights looped between maple trees, and the air carried smoke from the grill and cinnamon from Rose's pies. Laughter rose in soft bursts, not the nervous kind I heard at my wedding, but the kind that lets your shoulders drop. The guest list was small on purpose. Rose Harper moved through the crowd like a proud ant. Eddie Brooks stood near the gate with his men, relaxed enough to joke, still watching the road. Grant Hale arrived with his wife and their teenage son, and he handed Mia a tiny notebook because he remembered she liked to draw. The gardeners came in clean shirts. The kitchen staff finally sat to eat. For once, nobody looked like they were waiting for a mistake. Mia ran between chairs with her rabbit tucked under one arm, cheeks pink from the cold, hair flying free. She showed Rose a dance she learned at school, then darted off to chase fireflies near the herb beds. I watched her and felt something settle inside me. This place no longer felt lone to us. It felt like a home we had built with stubborn hands. Victor wore a white shirt with his sleeves rolled up, no tie, no jacket. He stood at the edge of the garden, eyes tracking Mia first, then me, as if he was measuring what he still had to protect. When our gaze met, he gave me a small nod, and my stomach tightened with the memory of the altar. As the music faded and plates emptied, Victor lifted a hand and the yard went quiet. He looked around at the people who kept his life running in the shadows, then, in his controlled way, admitted he had made a public choice at the wedding that hurt me because he believed locking his heart away was survival. He owned the fear underneath it, the way it had made him capable of protection, but not warmth. Then he faced me and explained what changed. I arrived as a stranger with a child and refused to disappear. I treated Rose and the staff like family. I demanded truth before rage, and stopped him from making a decision he could never undo. Mia's laughter filled rooms that used to echo. Hearing it said out loud made my eyes sting, because I still remembered how terrified I was. Victor's voice tightened, and he made the reversal my body had been craving since Chicago. His heart no longer lived in a locked room of grief. It lived here, with me, with this imperfect little family we'd stitched together. He said it plainly, because plainness was the only way he could be honest. I stepped closer and rested my hand on his cheek, feeling tension melt under my palm. He covered my wrist, gentle and certain, and the kiss he gave me was brief, respectful, and real. Around us, Rose started clapping first, then Eddie, then the rest, a wave of relief and joy that made me laugh through my tears. Grant's wife wiped her eyes and squeezed his arm. One of the gardeners whistled under his breath, then laughed at himself. Even the guards relaxed, my shoulders loosening like they'd been holding their breath for years. Mia woke enough to blink at us, then smiled, and curled back into her blanket. In that moment, I felt my dignity return to my skin. Later, when Mia fell asleep on a blanket beside the last warm lantern, I sat with Victor and watched the river glint beyond the trees. I thought about Elena, and how grief can be honored without being obeyed forever. I thought about fear, and how it steals your life one careful inch at a time. Love doesn't erase danger, but it gives you a reason to choose better people and better endings. If you were in my place, would you have walked away after the altar, or stayed long enough to learn the truth and build something new? Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep telling stories that turn pain into something worth living.